even if you can't do that, it's even simpler. All you need to do, and something that I preach constantly whenever I deal with companies, is whenever you make a decision, whenever you're trying to make a choice, just at the same meeting where you decide to make that choice, ask yourself, how could I know 6 months later whether or not I made the right choice 3 months later? Okay? What could we do? Is there a way to roll this out? Is there any way to try to at least get some sense of that? Okay? And the thing is, honestly, going back to incentives, that mostly people have no interest in knowing whether they're making the right choice. I mean, when you make a big decision, mostly you want no one to ever be able to tell whether it's the right decision or not, because it's just better not to, like the punishment for for really bad decisions is usually higher than the reward for a really good decision. And so people try to obfuscate, okay? But I think that you never learn in that kind of setting. Okay, and let me just finish with one quick story, which shows, I think, the power of this kind of just simple, thoughtful use of variation to try to get the answer to the problem. Okay, so I got to go back a bit. It turns out that around the time that I was beginning to do a lot of work with companies, I also was studying prostitution in the south side of Chicago with a really good sociologist named Sudhir Venkatesh, who I'd studied the gangs with. And we had just started a project where we took ex-prostitutes and we gave them clipboards and data sheets where they would go out, and we'd pay the prostitutes a little bit of money to just every time they did a trick to give us back all the data. Okay, so they would just record trick by trick everything that happened, and actually it was really amazing the insights that came out of that. So it turns out, for instance, that in the city of Chicago, if you are a street prostitute, you are more likely to have sex with an on-duty police officer than to be arrested by an on-duty police officer. So, that's the kind of thing we learned from this study. Okay, but that's not actually the point of this story. The point of the story is that about 1 week into that study, I got an email, and the email said, "Dear Professor Levitt, I understand that you've undertaken a study on street prostitution in the city of Chicago." And I thought, that's weird. I might get a lot of emails from readers and stuff, but how did this person know? I hadn't published anything. We just started. And then she went on to say, it became even more complex. She said, "I myself am a prostitute in the city of Chicago. I'm a high-priced escort." Okay? And only later, when I put the pieces together, did I understand that one of my friends who taught at the Chicago School of Business, the Booth School of Business, actually was her client. And that's how she had found out about this study, is that when he walked into her apartment where she did her tricks, she had Freakonomics. She's reading Freakonomics. They're sitting on the coffee table. And he was so surprised by that they got to talking about this study I was doing. So anyway, then what was really interesting about the email, though, was she said, "I have a Palm Pilot." Really dates how long ago it was. "I have a Palm Pilot with all of the data on all of the clients you've ever served. Is that the kind of information you're hoping to gather?" And I wrote her back and I said, "Well, that's absolutely the kind of data I'm trying to gather. Would you be willing to share it?" And she said, "Yes, I would. Why don't we go to brunch?" And I said, "Great, let's meet for brunch." And there's only one problem, which I was married at that time, and I had 4 young children, and I had to explain to my then wife why I was going to have brunch with a prostitute. And I said, "You have to believe me, she invited me, not vice versa." I mean, Anyway, so we got to talking about the data, and it only took about 7 minutes to figure out how we were going to depersonalize the data, whatever, and she'd give it to me. And there we were stuck at brunch, and I had no idea what we were going to talk about for the next 45 minutes. So I just started asking her every question I could about her business. And I was talking to lots of CEOs. I just asked her the same kind of questions I asked the CEOs. And it was actually remarkable how thoughtful she was in the responses she gave. But I finally stumped her. I said, "How did you set your prices?" Okay, and she gave me the same terrible answer that like almost every business gives me, which is, "Well, we had no idea what price to set." And she said, "So I just went online and decided to look, and I saw that some women were charging $500 an hour and some were charging $100, so I just decided to charge $300. Now, this was a smart woman. She was a college-educated woman. She was working as a computer programmer for a Fortune 50 company, making something like $80,000 a year, but she decided being a prostitute would be a better job, and she had quit her job, and she couldn't have been happier. So within a few months, she built her own webpage, and she was making something like $200,000 a year, working 10 to 15 hours a week, and she was just so happy about all the changes, okay? But when she told me about how she set prices, I was super frustrated because it's really aggravating because there's only really one thing that economists are really good at, and that's setting prices. And one of the most beautiful things that comes out of economic theory is how easy it is to set prices, right? Because if you took intermediate micro, you might remember the inverse elasticity rule. If you know the elasticity of demand and you know your marginal cost, then you basically know what you should be pricing, okay? So I started to think, well, is there some way that I might be able to figure out whether she was charging the right price? Because she clearly hadn't done it in a scientific way. And one of the things she had said to me earlier in the conversation is that she had a dedicated phone line that only her clients would call her on so that she could make sure that she kept her secret life as a call girl separate from her regular everyday life. And so I said to her, hey, when that second phone line rings, how do you feel? She said, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I'm happy, but mostly I'm kind of indifferent. And a lot of times I don't even pick it up. I'm just not even really in the mood. And I said, my God, you're a local monopolist. You have a downward sloping demand curve. If you could charge the same price to one extra marginal customer, if you're charging the right price, you should be so happy. Every time the phone rings, you should be jumping out of your chair if you're charging the right price. And she looked at me like, what are you talking about? And then I kind of snapped back into reality, and I remembered I was there to get her data, not to maximize her profits. And so I said, it doesn't matter, but I guarantee you're charging too low of a price. Anyway, we parted ways, and I never thought I'd see her again. I got her data, I analyzed her data. It was super interesting. But I was teaching a class on the economics of crime at the University of Chicago to the undergrads. And because I was doing this new research on prostitution, I thought I should add a new lecture on prostitution. And as I sat down to write the lecture, I didn't know anything yet. And it took me 2 hours. I had nothing good. And I suddenly had an epiphany. Why don't I call my new prostitute friend and have her come down and guest lecture for me at the university to the students? Because she seemed to know a lot about the economics of prostitution when I talked to her. So I called her on the phone. I said, hey, it's Professor Levitt. How would you feel about coming and doing a guest lecture? She said, oh no, I'm a very private person, and I'm a terrible public speaker. I could never do that. But I know enough about prostitutes and about economists to know that we have a lot of things in common. And among the things that we have in common is that, there's no such thing as something you can't do, right? For the right price, a prostitute or an economist will do anything. You've got to figure out what the right price is. So I said, well, what if I paid you your hourly wage? And she said, oh, my hourly wage? Oh, I would be delighted to come give a guest lecture for my hourly wage. Okay, and so it turned out she would have probably done it much cheaper, and she had totally out-bargained me. Prostitutes have a lot more skill, I think, at bargaining than academic economists. But she came down, she gave the lecture, and I have to say, it was amazing. It was a brilliant lecture. And I asked my students the next day what they thought, and literally a third of them said it was the single best lecture they had attended in 4 years at the University of Chicago, which is a pretty sad statement about what me and my colleagues are doing in the classroom. And after her prepared comments, we did Q&A, and one of the students raised his hand, and he said, well, how much do you charge? And she said, well, I charge $400 an hour. And I become livid, right? Because I know she charges she told me a month earlier she charges $300 an hour. And I was incredibly angry because she was there for 2 hours. So I was out of my own pocket. I had to pay her $600, right? Okay? And it's not like I could go to the National Science Foundation and say, I'm too lazy to write my own lecture, so I hired a prostitute to come down and teach them. Can you put in my research grant? But even worse, I had made this nice note, and I wanted her to feel like she was being treated in a very classy way. I had a nice card and very crisp, 6 crisp $100 bills, and all sealed up. And then she says she charges $400 an hour or something. I'm going to look like a cheapskate if I don't give her $800 for 2 hours. And so I have to scramble around and get a bunch of dirty old, broken up 20s and open the envelope. And I'm super pissed more than anything because she's just lying. Right? And I thought we had a relationship, but then she just lies to the audience, says $400, and I'm just livid about the whole thing. It ruined the entire day for me. And then after she answered the question, one of the women in the class raised her hand and said, well, how did you decide how much to charge? And she turns to me. I was sitting over in the corner of the room, and she has this big beaming smile on her face, and she said, well, you know, the very first time that I was with Professor Levitt, he convinced me my services were far more valuable than the $300 I was currently charging. So I raised my price to $400, and I tell you, it is the best business decision I've ever made. I put an extra $3,000 or $4,000 in the bank just in the last month. Okay, and that's the power of feedback. Because if she had never raised her prices, she would have never known.